An old patient walked slowly into the conference room, leaning on his cane, silver hair, eyes deep and solemn. All the doctors, directors, lawyers, senators, every gaze turned toward him. They didn't know that man was Chuck Norris. He looked up and spoke just one sentence in a low, steady voice. "Time's up." In that moment, the entire room of power froze, breath caught in their throats. Today, justice would have a voice. Early morning, the sky was draped in a thin white mist. St. James Military Hospital lay quietly in the pale morning light, its moss-covered facade and half-closed iron gate holding back a past full of hidden burdens. A small silver truck stopped at the entrance. The door opened, and from inside stepped a silver-bearded man, eyes dark and intense. His hair had turned with time, but his frame still stood firm, like an oak in a storm. It was Chuck Norris. He didn't bring much luggage, just an old fraying bag and a thin medical file. His private doctor had requested a follow-up after his heart surgery 2 months ago. This time, Chuck wanted to keep things simple. No media. No real name on the paperwork, just quietly returning, like any ordinary veteran among the hundreds who had once served their country. The nurse at the front desk glanced quickly at the file. Name: Charles Norris. Chuck gave a slight smile and nodded. "That's right. Which room, miss?" "Room 310, 3rd floor. Your attending is Dr. Blackwell, head of cardiology." That name made Chuck pause for a second. He'd heard of the man before. A veteran doctor, highly skilled but known for being harsh, old-fashioned, and unpleasant toward anyone not fitting the proper military standards in his eyes. But Chuck wasn't here just for a heart checkup. He was observing, looking for something, or someone. St. James wasn't just any hospital. It had once treated thousands of soldiers returning from war, from Vietnam, Afghanistan to Iraq. It was also where Chuck had once rushed his own teammates for emergency care, and where he had quietly said farewell to a few who never came back. The long hallways, old patterned tile floors, and walls hung with generals' portraits all looked the same. But the air felt different now. The hospital had been modernized, expanded, and staffed with more personnel. But the old bonds, the camaraderie, seemed to be fading. Chuck stepped into the elevator. A group of young doctors in white coats chatted nearby. They glanced at him, none offering a greeting. One whispered, "Who's that old guy walking like a 3-star general?" Chuck heard it clearly, but he stood still, eyes on the elevator's floor numbers. To him, every mocking word from his soldiering days was just wind in passing. This wasn't the first time, but this time he wasn't alone. 3rd floor. Chuck stepped out of the elevator and immediately saw something that made him stop. A young Latina doctor was being berated by a silver-haired man right there in the hallway. "How many times have I told you, Dr. Sophia? Cardiology patients cannot follow that protocol. Where did you even learn such reckless habits?" The young woman stood upright, clipboard in hand. "Sir, I only adjusted it based on the patient's renal failure. Without changing the meds, he could develop pulmonary edema." Blackwell cut her off. "I didn't ask for your reasoning. I asked you to follow orders. Here at St. James, we don't need rookies coming in here showing off. Especially people like you." He stressed the words, "people like you." The contempt was plain and undisguised. Nearby, patients and nurses stood frozen. No one defended Sophia. No one dared say anything. Their eyes averted, their ears pretending not to hear. Chuck, though, remained standing. He watched the young woman, saw her determined eyes, her slightly trembling hands, yet her unwillingness to back down. Sophia bowed her head slightly, softly murmuring, "I'm sorry for acting on my own. I just wanted to save the patient." Blackwell shot her a glare and turned away, leaving the young woman standing alone in the hallway, like a single leaf in a crowded courtyard. That afternoon, Chuck sat in his hospital room, reading and jotting notes, but his ears stayed alert, catching every sound from the corridor. Two young nurses whispered outside his door. Poor Sophia. Not even 3 months here and already getting crushed. Well, what can you do? She's not real military blood. Her mum's an immigrant. She trained at a civilian school. And that old guy who just got admitted today, Charles something, his eyes are scary. Chuck smiled slightly. He closed his book, stood up, and stepped into the hallway. "Excuse me, where's Dr. Sophia?" The two nurses jumped, startled, turning around. "Oh, she's probably still in room 302. Tough case, the patient is reacting badly to meds." Chuck nodded. He walked slowly in that direction. Room 302 housed an elderly man who had fought in the Korean War, now struggling with heart disease and renal failure. Chuck peered through the glass and saw Sophia adjusting the blood pressure monitor, sweat beading on her forehead. The patient's wife sat nearby, clutching his hand, trembling. Chuck knocked gently. "Excuse me, may I come in?" Sophia turned, mildly surprised to see Chuck. "You are?" Chuck smiled. "I'm the patient in room 310, but once upon a time, I worked a little farther than just a few buildings over." There was something in his eyes, old, deep, trustworthy. Sophia nodded, asking no further questions. She continued caring for the patient. Chuck quietly took a seat, watching, listening. That night, the hospital room was silent. Chuck opened his old phone, went to his notes app, and typed, "Blackwell controls medical orders, undermines Sophia. Signs of using authority to cause disruption. Investigate further. Sophia, dedicated, providing proper care. Reminds me of Nurse Mary. Southeast Asia battlefield, 1969. He needs further observation. CM. Finished." He closed his eyes. But sleep wouldn't come. Instead, images filled his mind. Of old comrades, of nameless nurses wiping sweat from broken soldiers, of people who endured harsh rebukes, yet never gave up. He whispered a line, the line he'd sworn when he brought his last surviving friend home after the war. "The day comes when I no longer carry a gun. Then these hands will hold the hands of the kindest fighters in the battle." And now, he thought, maybe he'd found that person. The next morning, at first light, Chuck was already awake. His figure appeared faintly in the early rays filtering through the curtains, and he was dressed in a white hospital gown. But if you looked closely, from his eyes, his posture, his silent stance, you'd know this was no tired old man. This was a battle-hardened warrior who never sat still in the face of injustice. Sophia passed down the hallway, arms full of patient files. She caught sight of Chuck walking slowly in the courtyard, doing light exercises. A flicker of curiosity stirred in her. Something about that patient she couldn't look away from. Back in the department meeting room, Sophia was pulled into the morning staff briefing. Dr. Blackwell sat at the head of the table, his eyes cold as they swept the room. "We need to cut 20% of staffing costs in the veterans wing," he said. "But," Sophia tried to protest, but Blackwell raised a hand. "No buts, that's the directive from above." A colleague's eyes darted away as she looked around. Sophia felt like she was standing alone on thin ice. That afternoon, Chuck accidentally sat near the reception desk, overhearing snatches of conversation between a senior doctor and a financial manager. "That money is being funneled into the VIP renovation project for officials. And the poor veterans? Who cares? Officials bring in the real cash." Chuck closed his eyes, each word hitting him like invisible bullets. On the battlefield he'd learned, Leave one man behind and the whole team suffers. Here, it was the same. If Sophia was being pushed down, it meant the weakest patients were being abandoned. That evening, when Sophia finally took a break in the cafeteria, Chuck appeared, carrying 2 coffees. "You take it black?" he asked. Yes, I do," Sophia replied shyly, accepting the cup. Chuck sat down, quietly observing her. Her face showed clear fatigue, dark circles under her eyes, hands cracked from over-sanitizing, shoulders bent as if carrying the weight of the world. "You're a good doctor," Chuck said abruptly. "I'm not sure," Sophia said with a weary smile. "I'm sure." He looked straight into her eyes. "I've met many people, on the battlefield, in hospitals, on the road of life. I know who truly has a heart." Sophia's eyes shimmered, uncertain. "Mr. Norris, why do you care about me?" "Because I was once a young fighter too, and I once promised if I met someone kind in this world, I wouldn't let them fight alone." Sophia bit her lip, holding back tears. In the following days, Chuck paid closer attention. He spoke with an old doctor, a former battlefield friend, now an honorary advisor. He sat with an elderly veteran, listening to how treatment options were being cut. He chatted with security staff, asking who frequently visited Dr. Blackwell's office late at night. Piece by piece, a picture emerged. The veterans' care budget was being siphoned into luxury projects for officials. Radiant staff were rewarded. Anyone who resisted was isolated or set up for failure. Sophia was now firmly in the crosshairs and could be ousted at any moment. One late night, Sophia came to Chuck's room. She sank into the chair, her face pale. "I just got a warning. They're planning to blame me for that patient's death last week." "Did you make a mistake?" Chuck asked. "I checked several times, but they say the file is missing a signature. I don't remember leaving anything out." Chuck leaned back and closed his eyes. "They're cornering you." "But what should I do?" Sophia whispered. "You fight. But you don't fight alone." He opened a drawer, pulling out a small piece of paper. Written on it were several names. "These people will help, trust me." The next morning, Sophia received a call from a senator who was a former veteran. The senator said they would investigate the internal complaint process. Chuck whispered over the phone to an old war correspondent. "You want a special story? I have evidence." He also sent a short text to a lawyer, someone who owed him an old favor. "I need you, right now." Dr. Blackwell was no fool. He started to sense something was off. Sophia kept smiling, no longer showing fear. Veteran patients were strangely close to that old man Norris. Internal meetings were leaking information. He called the hospital administrator, ordering a full review of every document Sophia had signed. He issued an internal directive. Minimize patient contact with Mr. Norris. Don't let him interfere. But it was too late. Chuck had already begun his battle, not with guns, but with a network of trust. That night, Chuck sat alone, gazing out over the hospital grounds. A soft breeze carried echoes of young soldiers' laughter from long ago. In his memory he heard gunfire, comrades calling each other. A friend fell. Chuck ran to lift him, shouting, "Don't die, we're not home yet." Now he was home. But his comrade was a young woman, struggling to survive in a different kind of war. A war of greed, of contempt, of hidden power. Chuck told himself, don't let her fight alone, because a soldier's final promise is never an empty vow. The storm had begun, but the sky was still calm. Chuck knew the real battle was coming. An old man, a young woman, an unspoken promise. They were bound together. Tomorrow Chuck Norris will go to war, not with bullets, but with honor. That morning, the skies over St. James were grey, as if they too sensed something simmering beneath the calm surface. Chuck Norris awoke early, as always. Though a patient, he maintained his soldier's routine, up before dawn, deep breathing, a cold water rinse, and clearing his mind. Today was no ordinary day. Sophia entered the hospital with a heavy stack of files on her shoulder. She no longer wore the face of resignation. Though she knew Dr. Blackwell and the whole machine were pushing her into a corner, today she felt different, because she knew Chuck was there. Last night, a strange lawyer called, asking about the medical records process in detail, because this morning, a veteran senator had texted, "We're watching. Don't sign any papers blaming you." In the hospital hallway, her colleagues' glances shifted, no longer just cold, but now mixed with curiosity and caution. What was happening with Sophia? Who was protecting her? No one knew. Only Chuck, silently watching everything, knew the trap was already closing. 9. Cardiology Department Conference Room. Dr. Blackwell sat at the head of the table, surrounded by doctors, senior nurses, and administrators. On the table lay the file of the deceased patient from last week, alongside the internal report. "I have reviewed the matter," Blackwell began, his voice steady but deliberate, "and found several irregularities related to Dr. Sophia's signature." "Excuse me," Sophia tried to interject. "We will let the in-house lawyers handle this," Blackwell said, flashing a thin smile. "For now, Sophia is suspended from clinical duties." In that instant, Sophia felt her heart clench. But just then the conference room door swung open. Chuck Norris, dressed in a simple shirt and leaning on his cane, appeared in the doorway. No one invited him, no one notified him, but there he stood, unyielding. "Sorry to interrupt," Chuck said, voice low and clear, "but I believe I have some important information." The entire room fell silent. A patient intervening in an internal meeting. Blackwell narrowed his eyes, his voice hardening. "Mr. Norris, this is not a matter for patients." Chuck looked straight into Blackwell's eyes. "The problem is, this isn't just an internal matter. It's a matter of honor, and I have some friends who are very interested in hearing about this." He placed a USB drive on the table. "Inside are recordings from other staff. If necessary, I can ask the media to review them." The air froze. Blackwell's face paled. Sophia looked at Chuck, eyes welling up. In her whole life, no one had ever stood up for her like this. The night before, Chuck had called on a few old comrades from the war, now journalists, lawyers, even former defense officials. He knew one thing: facing a system, one person isn't enough. But a network, that's different. That network had quietly gathered information from silenced staff, from shady financial transfers, from altered medical records. Chuck only needed to send out one signal. Now's the time. Blackwell didn't fold easily. He called an emergency meeting with the board. In a private room, he fumed. "That Norris is just an old vet. I'll make sure he disappears from this hospital." But Blackwell didn't know that. Outside, Chuck had sent a handwritten letter, written and signed by himself, to the state's veterans commander. That letter didn't just tell Sophia's story. It told of a rotting system, of forgotten veteran patients, of a vow never to stay silent before injustice. That evening, Chuck and Sophia sat by the window. Outside, the hospital lights flickered, reflecting off their faces. "Aren't you afraid?" Sophia asked softly. "Of course I am," Chuck smiled. "I've been afraid of many things, losing comrades, losing my life, losing myself. But the thing I fear most is seeing evil and doing nothing." He looked at her, eyes gentle yet firm. "You're not alone, Sophia. Tomorrow, we go to battle." Sophia clutched his hand, eyes shimmering. "I don't know how to thank you." Chuck patted her shoulder. "Thank me by standing tall, by fighting, by never giving up." In another room, Dr. Blackwell crushed a leaked financial report in his fist. He roared, Call the lawyers, call security, I'm wiping these people out. But his phone rang. A deep, rumbling voice came through. Hello, Mr. Blackwell. This is Senator Hughes. We've just received the hospital's records. I suggest you prepare for an investigation. Blackwell's face turned white. He had never imagined that an old patient, a young doctor, could strike at the heart of his power. But Chuck Norris was no ordinary old patient, and Sophia was no longer a timid young doctor. Tomorrow, the curtain would be lifted. Chuck lay on his hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, silently vowing, "Tomorrow, I will keep my promise." A final promise, for all those who no longer have a voice. In her room, Sophia clenched her fists, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. Tomorrow, I won't bow my head anymore. Outside, the wind rose, spinning leaves around like the whispered voices of veteran spirits from the past. Rise up, it's time to fight. The next morning, the atmosphere at St. James Hospital was completely different. Tense, expectant. Whispers rippled through the halls, from the nurse stations to the cafeteria, from inpatient floors to the administrative wing. Is that old man Norris someone important? I heard he got a senator down here. Dr. Blackwell's in big trouble. As Sophia walked by, she felt the gazes shift, no longer just cold stares, now mixed with curiosity, caution, and even a trace of respect. 10 a.m. Room 310. Chuck sat in a chair, with Sophia in front of him, Lawyer Allen, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair, and Senator Hughes, the famously outspoken veteran senator. Here's the plan, Chuck said calmly, his deep voice steady. We need a three-pronged strike, internal, media, and legal. Allen nodded. I've prepared a request for an independent investigation into the hospital's financial management. Hughes added, I'll bring this issue before the state legislature, especially the problem of cutting veteran care costs. Chuck looked at Sophia, his gaze softening. And you, Sophia, your job is to stand firm. Don't sign any admissions of fault. Don't accept being set up. You are the most important witness. Sophia swallowed hard, eyes brimming. Can you trust me? Chuck smiled. I once trusted younger soldiers than you, on battlefields far harsher, and they never let me down. Inside his office, Dr. Blackwell paced furiously, face flushed. Do the press release. We have to fight back. Issue a press release. This is just an internal misunderstanding. Clean up any compromising files. Anyone who dares leak to the media, fire them immediately. But there were things he couldn't clean. The news had already spread. A small article appeared on the Veterans Affairs news portal. Power abuse risks at St. James Hospital. Once a military pride, now under scrutiny. Blackwell slammed his desk. You old veteran bastards, you think you can scare me? That afternoon, Chuck was invited up to the executive suite. Not an honor given to just any patient. Blackwell sat behind his desk, a cold smile on his face. Norris. I don't know what you want, but this is a military hospital, not a hero's stage. Chuck looked him straight in the eyes, replying slowly. I don't need a stage. I just need the truth. Truth? Blackwell snorted. You think a few scraps of gossip can change this system? Chuck rose, adjusting his shirt. Not just me, us. Us? Blackwell frowned. Chuck gave a small nod. An entire generation of veterans, an entire network of people no longer afraid. You can threaten individuals, but you can't threaten all of us. Blackwell narrowed his eyes, voice low. You're playing with fire, Norris. Chuck turned to go, leaving behind just one quiet sentence. I've lived in fire before, Dr. Blackwell. That evening, Sophia gathered a small group of young nurses and doctors, people who had silently witnessed injustice but kept their heads down. He said, I know you're afraid, I'm afraid too, but If we don't speak up today, someone else will be crushed tomorrow. I'm not asking you to pick a fight. I'm only asking you to tell the truth." The young doctor hesitated. "Are you sure you won't get fired?" Sophia smiled, eyes steely. "If they fire me for defending patients, I'd rather leave than stay here bowing my head." One pair of eyes lifted, then another, then the whole group. A small spark had just been ignited. Chuck sat by his bed, looking out the window. Outside, the faint glow of hospital lights dotted the yard. Inside his heart, an old voice echoed, from a comrade who had fallen long ago. "Chuck, if I don't make it back, promise me you'll look after those we leave behind." Chuck whispered softly to himself, "I promised, and I'm still keeping that promise." He closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. Tomorrow, everything would explode. At 7 a.m., the board called an emergency meeting. The media were aware. Senator Hughes personally arrived at the hospital. Lawyer Allen submitted a formal request for an investigation. Sophia, along with a group of young staff, signed an internal petition. Chuck stood in the hallway, arms folded, watching everything swirl like a gathering storm. An old security guard approached quietly, patting him on the shoulder. "Back in the day I heard your name, Mr. Norris. Now I believe legends never grow old." Chuck smiled, a sharp glint in his eye. "Thank you. But I'm no legend. I'm just a man keeping his promise." Tomorrow, Blackwell would face justice. Tomorrow, Sophia would no longer be labeled just a young doctor. Tomorrow, Chuck would fulfill his final promise. To protect the good. Chuck Norris rose from his bed earlier than usual. Though his heart had been through surgery, though doctors still advised him to rest, he put on his coat, tied his shoes, looked in the mirror, straightened his collar, and gazed deeply at his reflection. He murmured quietly to himself, "Today I'm not a patient. Today I'm a soldier." Outside his room, Sophia stood at the door, clutching a bundle of documents, hands trembling slightly. She hadn't slept all night. When Chuck opened the door, Sophia looked up, her eyes red but burning with fire. "Are you ready?" Chuck smiled softly, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Ready? Are you?" Sophia tightened her grip on the files, took a deep breath. Ready. The fourth-floor hallway, usually noisy, was strangely silent today. As Chuck and Sophia walked past, people glanced at them like two unfamiliar winds sweeping through familiar territory. A few young doctors gave subtle nods. A few older nurses quietly lifted their phones, dialing unknown numbers. A few office managers slammed their doors, peeking through blinds. Chuck walked, each step heavy but steady, as if every footfall had been carved long ago, from old battlefields to today's front line. The hospital's large boardroom was on the 6th floor. Inside, Dr. Blackwell sat in the chairman's seat, arms crossed, his face pale, but still forcing a faint, cold smile. To his left sat the board of directors. To his right are the in-house legal team, financial managers, and department heads. At the head of the table sat Senator Hughes, his face grim, fingers tapping lightly on the table. Across from him, Lawyer Allen sat sharp-eyed, files and evidence neatly arranged before him. On the large wall screen hung the latest headline: St. James Military Hospital, accused of abuse of power, discrimination, and cutting veteran care budgets. No one spoke. No one dared take a loud breath. Until the doors swung open. The room held its breath. That old man, dressed simply in a button-up shirt, khaki pants, worn leather shoes, back just slightly straight, silver hair, eyes deep as an ocean. He wasn't a politician. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't an executive. He was just a patient. But when Chuck Norris walked in, the space seemed to tighten, the air grew dense, and every gaze locked onto him. Blackwell gave a thin smile, trying to sound light. "Mr. Norris, we don't need patients present at this meeting." Chuck said nothing. He stepped to the center of the room, slowly turned, his eyes sweeping over each face. He gave a small nod to Senator Hughes, a nod to Sophia, a nod to Alan. Finally, his gaze fixed on Dr. Blackwell. In that moment, the crowded room shrank down, leaving only two men facing each other. Chuck spoke, his voice low, steady, deliberate. "Have you ever been to war, Dr. Blackwell?" No one expected the opening to be such a simple question. Blackwell frowned slightly. "I don't think that's relevant." Chuck shifted forward half a step, his voice not raised, yet every word crystal clear. "I'll ask again, have you ever been to war?" Blackwell swallowed hard. No one else dared break the silence. Chuck turned to Senator Hughes, voice still calm. "Senator, do you know how many people we lost out there?" Hughes gave a slow nod, eyes glinting with shared pain. Chuck turned back to Blackwell. "Do you know how many comrades I lost right here, in rooms like these, on beds like these?" Blackwell licked his lips, eyes flickering. Behind him, some young doctors lowered their heads. Sophia squeezed her hands tightly, drawing a quiet, long breath. Chuck raised his hand, pointing firmly at the table. "Whose blood are you standing on, Dr. Blackwell?" No one was smiling anymore. No one dared make a joke. The entire room was drenched in raw truth. Numbers files, budgets, all built on the sweat, tears and blood of soldiers, of people who never came home. Chuck leaned forward, both hands resting on the table, locking eyes with Blackwell. "How far do you think your bought power can reach?" Blackwell opened his mouth, as if to say something, but his throat caught. The in-house lawyer flipped nervously through the files, sweat beading on his forehead. An older department head closed his eyes, sighing quietly. Chuck straightened, delivering one slow, heavy line, each word falling like a hammer. "Time's up." No one laughed. No one offered a defense. No one came to Blackwell's rescue. Blackwell sat frozen, lips pressed tight, eyes reddening, hands clenched hard on the table. Lawyer Allen slid the stack of files toward the board. "We formally request the immediate suspension of Dr. Blackwell and a full independent investigation." Senator Hughes gave a slow, deliberate nod. "And I will bring this matter before the state legislature." Behind them, Sophia stood silently, eyes glistening, hands trembling softly. She hadn't needed to say a word. Chuck had spoken it all for her. The news spread faster than anyone anticipated. The hospital leadership announced Blackwell's temporary suspension. An independent investigation team was dispatched. Journalists began swarming the story, from "the young doctor under threat" to "the legendary veteran who spoke up." Chuck returned to his hospital room, quietly closed the door, sat down in the chair, leaned back and smiled softly as he closed his eyes. That evening, Sophia knocked on his door. Chuck opened his eyes to see her stepping in, hair tousled, eyes red, but her smile radiant. "You know what?" Sophia said, her voice hoarse. "They just called me up. I've been invited to join the hospital's internal reform committee." Chuck smiled gently, his eyes tender. "You deserve it." Sophia sat by his bedside, softly holding his hand. "I don't know how to thank you." Chuck shook his head. "Don't thank me. Thank yourself. You stood up. I just helped you see how strong you already were." That night, after Sophia left the room, Chuck sat alone. He gazed out the window as light rain fell. The soft pattering on the glass stirred countless memories. Fallen friends, battles long past, promises kept. He closed his eyes, whispering, "My brothers, I kept my word. I'm still fighting for the kindest among us." Outside, the rain fell, washing away the dirt, cleansing every shadowed corner. A new chapter was beginning. Not with weapons, but with truth, courage and honor. Morning sunlight streamed through the blinds of room 3010, drawing long golden lines across the hospital floor. Chuck Norris sat by the window, a hot cup of coffee in hand, gazing out over the hospital courtyard. He had stayed up late the night before, not out of worry, not from regret, but because, for the first time in many years, he felt his heart grow light. He had done what needed to be done. He had kept his final promise. The door creaked open gently. Sophia entered, wearing a fresh white coat, her hair tied back high, a small new name tag pinned to her chest. Dr. Sophia Alvarez, member, Hospital Reform Committee. She smiled brightly at Chuck. I was officially appointed this morning. Chuck gave a small nod, his eyes gleaming softly. I told you so. Sophia sat down beside his bed, gently taking his hand. I couldn't have done it without you. Chuck gave her hand a light squeeze, his voice slow and warm. You already had the strength. I just reminded you you carried it. Across the hospital, small changes were beginning to ripple. Young staff began meeting in groups, sharing ideas for improvement. Veteran doctors started quietly reflecting, wondering how long it had been since they last spoke up. The leadership prepared to receive the independent investigation team, opening their records, for the first time, to real scrutiny. Outside, the press ran headlines. James, a story of a legendary veteran and a young doctor who dared to stand against the old guard. The last promise of Chuck Norris, when courage has no age limit. A week later, Chuck packed his things. He stood before the mirror, buttoned up his old jacket, straightened his back, lifted his worn bag onto his shoulder. Sophia walked him all the way to the hospital gates. They stood together on the steps, looking at each other, silent. Finally, Chuck smiled. You'll be all right. Sophia took a deep breath, nodding. I'll never forget you. Chuck placed a hand gently on her shoulder, his eyes deep and calm, his voice soft. Don't remember me. Remember what you've learned. Remember that a true warrior isn't the one who carries a gun, it's the one who stands up when others fall. As Chuck left the hospital, strange calls began to reach him. A journalist from a veterans publication. Mr. Norris, would you be willing to share your story? A young lawyer. I wanted your advice on helping nurses who are forced to falsify records. A group of veterans emailed, we'd like you to join our honorary advisory board. Chuck smiled. He had never sought the spotlight. But if his voice could become a torch, lighting the way for others, he was ready. Meanwhile, Sophia threw herself into her work with all her heart. She met with department heads, proposed new procedures. She listened to the ideas of nurses, orderlies, even cleaning staff, voices that had never been invited to the table before. She faced skeptical looks, whispered comments, but she stood firm. Whenever she felt tired, she remembered Chuck. Remembered his hand on her shoulder. Remembered his words. A true warrior doesn't need to carry a gun. A true warrior carries heart. It wasn't long before the Chuck Norris effect spread beyond St. James. Other military hospitals began reviewing their internal policies. Veterans associations opened forums to discuss fair treatment for young, multi-ethnic, diverse staff. A new resolution was drafted in the state legislature, proposing an independent oversight mechanism for military medical facilities. Chuck heard about it from an old friend. You know, Chuck, you stood up in one place and it's making the whole system look at itself. Chuck laughed over the phone. I didn't stand up alone, I had a team. 3 months later, Chuck sat in a small coffee shop near his home, reading a book. A cheerful voice called from behind. Mr. Norris? He turned. Sophia stood there, beaming, a thick folder in her hands. I came all the way here with good news. They sat down together, Sophie excitedly sharing. I've just been invited to present at the National Healthcare Conference to talk about St. James the Reform model. Chuck chuckled. See? I told you. You're a warrior. Sophia tilted her head, her eyes sparkling mischievously. Want to come with me? Be an honorary guest? Chuck took a sip of coffee, gazed out the window and said softly, Go, you tell the story, it's your story. I'm just the old shadow that passed by. As Sophia left the cafe, Chuck sat alone. He looked up at the vast blue sky, whispering to himself, My brothers, I kept my promise. I found the next generation, and they're better than we were. He closed his eyes, leaned back in his chair, smiling quietly. He no longer needed to stand on the front line, no longer needed to wield a weapon, no longer needed to brace himself. He only needed to trust. Trust that the seeds he had planted had taken root, had sprouted, had begun growing into mighty trees. The story of Chuck and Sophia was not just a tale of bravery. It was a story of legacy, of how one generation passes the torch to the next, of how even a small promise, if faithfully kept, can create great change. Chuck once said, A warrior isn't just someone who carries a gun. A warrior is someone who carries a promise in their heart and never betrays it. Sophia once asked, And when you're gone, who will keep the next promise? Chuck had only smiled, not answering, because he knew. Sophia already understood. The next promise keeper was her, and after her, it would be someone else. And so, the flame would never go out. One late afternoon, Chuck sat alone on a park bench, watching the sky fade into sunset. Beside him, a little boy played and laughed, running circles. Nearby, the young mother smiled. Thank you for watching my son for a bit, Mr. Norris. Chuck nodded kindly. It's nothing. I'm just doing what an old soldier ought to do. The boy ran over, pressing a tiny wildflower into Chuck's hand. Here, mister, for you. Chuck took the small bloom, feeling his heart stir with a strange, tender ache. He whispered softly to himself, So it turns out, I still have promises to keep. Promises to make sure this world still has children who can laugh. Promises to keep that flame burning, never letting it go out. The lesson left behind. Courage has no age. Promise, even a small one, if kept faithfully, can change an entire system. Big change begins with one person willing to stand up, but it takes a whole generation to carry it forward. Honor doesn't live in medals. It lives in how we protect those weaker than ourselves.